And now it's time for our panel discussion where we'll discuss the topic keeping up with future fraudsters and their schemes.
Exactly. And this is a very important topic for auditors to be aware of. And the good news is we have 4 expert panelists. They are going to walk us through this, and they're going to tell us all about the things we need to know to be on the lookout for these dynamics.
All right, so let's take a minute to meet each one.
First, we have Jennica Moore, a doctor who is going to tell us from her 20 years of business and accounting experience that she has accumulated over the years. So she has a PhD in advanced accounting, an MBA with a specialization in accounting, and a Bachelor of Business Administration in finance. She's a licensed CPA and a certified fraud examiner. For the past 10 years, Jennica has taught at several universities. She has published 2 academic journal articles on accounting fraud. She is the managing director of Carson, Madison, LLC, a national corporate fraud consulting firm.
And we have Lorraine Shipp. Lorraine is the president of Forensic Power Source and a certified fraud examiner. Lorraine has had roles in internal audit, forensic audit, corporate security, and consulting, saving organizations millions of dollars. She's managed and led significant investigations involving tax evasion, money laundering, embezzlement, and bribery, and has recovered and saved millions of dollars for organizations by implementing comprehensive plan approaches to risk management.
Next is Lillian Spell. Lillian is the founder and president of Internal AuditRx, an internal audit consulting firm that provides internal audit, coaching, and training services. She has over 16 years of internal audit experience and multiple certifications, including Certified Fraud Examiner, Certified Government Auditing Professional, Certified Internal Auditor, Certified in Risk and Information Systems Control, and Certification in Risk Management Assurance.
And we have Deidre Melton. Deidre is the audit director for Florida A&M University, where she serves as an assurance, risk management, investigative, and advisory professional. Deidre specializes in information technology, cybersecurity, and best practices for internal controls management to reduce inefficiencies and fraud. Deidre is a certified fraud examiner, certified internal auditor, certified data privacy solutions engineer, certified information systems auditor, certified information security manager, and certified in risk and information systems controls. I don't think there's any others after that list. It's really impressive. All right, Hernán, well, I'm going to step aside and let you take on this discussion and take the lead. So here we go.
Thanks, Don. Yes, so we are going to start to take a look at these very important dynamics associated with fraud, and we have these 4 experts on our panel today. So I would like to kick things off with a question that is kind of overarching in many respects. So what new types of fraud are you seeing in your practice? Let me start with Lorraine. Lorraine, what have you been seeing lately?
A lot more vendor fraud, delivery of goods and services fraud, and I'm looking at force majeure issues with contracts and pricing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have a lot of vendor-related supply dynamics there. Lillian, what are you seeing in your practice?
I think I agree. It's more contract related, as well as maybe continue to be asset misappropriation and inventory theft.
Inventory theft. Wow. Well, that's not exactly a new one, but it's interesting to see that it's happening in your environment, because this is, again, one of those dynamics that as we think about it, it keeps coming up. And I think it's very important for our audience to keep that in mind, that it's not always that it's a new, again, we'll talk about cybersecurity in a moment. I have a few questions related to that I'm curious about. But one of the challenges is that sometimes we think about, well, the old is gone and now we are looking ahead and it's all new. Not necessarily. So I am very intrigued by this. So this is very, very interesting to me. I'm going to ask one more of you, and then I'm going to pivot to something else. So Deidre, is that also similar in your case? What are you seeing in your practice as it relates to some of these fraud schemes and where things seem to be going?
Well, I work in the educational entity, and what I've noticed over the past year is an increase in grant fraud, how they are applying those charges to those grants and those federal funds. and things of that nature. Also, an increase in time reporting as many people are working remotely. You're seeing people not reporting time when they're not working, or even working duplicate jobs when they're supposed to be on the clock.
Interesting. Wow. Okay. Well, that definitely raises a few questions because as we think about our world and how people are going to be, in many cases, distributed or working remotely, then this may definitely raise some challenges for us in terms of what we're going to pay attention to. But remember what we heard earlier in terms of focusing on output, not just outcomes rather than outputs. So from that perspective, then, it definitely raises some questions about how we're going to look at some of these dynamics. But people are creative, and we have to be always cautious about that. In general, are we seeing fraud increasing, holding, or decreasing? So, Jennica, what's been your experience lately as relates to that? Is fraud and the incidence of it, and we can talk in terms of how frequently it happens and the amount or the impact of it. What's your perspective on that?
For me, it's definitely increasing. The amount of fraud just in general has gone up, but we're seeing cyber fraud increase, and like you mentioned, the time reporting. You've got remote employees at home, so you don't have someone watching them, and we're looking at a lot of padding of the time reports. Also, elder fraud has gone up because the elderly are very trusting and they may not be technologically savvy, and so if they see a website that it looks like it's a real website, they may be more likely to click on it and maybe open an email link that looks like it's legit. So a lot of increase in elder fraud.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's an important thing to keep in mind because, again, we're talking about different populations. Mm-hmm. And quite often we'll think about, well, what happens within our organizations? But we need to be mindful of the fact that we may have our customers, we may have our vendors, we may have our employees. And for some of you that work in, for example, nonprofit environments or government, you may also have the population at large to be mindful of and help to protect them as well. So from that perspective, I am curious about how you're looking at some of these dynamics associated with phishing, right? I think Jennica, to some extent, is alluding to that email that comes in and people get tempted to click on that and see what that's about. Are you seeing something like that as well, Lorraine? Is that something that working with your clients, that is a concerning dynamic that is triggering fraudulent actions?
Well, I'm seeing a lot of lapses of control because of people were either laid off or there was a reorganization. And because of that, these phishing schemes have been increasing. So you'll look to, say, maybe Treasury, and someone will call in and say, I want to have my invoice paid in a new bank account, and here's the new routing number. And then those controls that were in place are not there anymore because that person was either laid off or reorganization and not there. So really everyone needs to start looking at their processes to make sure that those lapses, because someone isn't there or working from home, really they need to be there.
A large percentage of our viewers today work in government, actually in education. Mm-hmm. And I am very curious about, I'll ask you, Lorraine, while we're chatting about this particular topic, and then I'm going to ask Lillian's perspective on this one. But in your experience, are you seeing in the nonprofit sector, in government circles, that this dynamic is more prevalent, and is this creating a problem, a challenge for them to keep fraud at bay because of this?
Well, I think that training is so important, no matter if you're working for government, the private sector, or in education. So again, we need to make sure that all of these new schemes that people have in their business units have very controlled training in terms of what department they're in. So if you're in payroll, maybe start looking at different payroll schemes so that they can be aware of those things and have a place to report those wrongdoings.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much for that. Lillian, so when you're thinking about an educational institution, we have a lot of viewers that work in academic environments. So what are you seeing as relates to this, and how can we help the organization protect itself from these type of problems?
I think, again, like training employees in regards to their responsibility in those internal controls is very important. I think from an internal audit perspective, I think we need to understand our role in fighting fraud and preventing and detecting fraud, but also provide that information to those business units that what their role is when it comes to fighting and preventing and deterring fraud as well. My experience in the education field, it's a lot of information providing to those units, because I think the assumption is that internal audit knows and is responsible for fraud management, which is not 100% the case. And so I think that's important for that training component to be really pushed forward.
Okay. Deidre, working in a university, you probably have an insight into how training is provided. So as we're talking about how some of these dynamics are impacting organizations in the nonprofit sector and government, you have an intimate understanding of the university environment and academic circles and so on. As relates to this dynamic around trust and how fraudsters are using it as a phishing tool and so on. How is their university, and not just yours, but in general, how is education being imparted to the staff and administrators so that they can be more cautious in addition to the academic side of the organization, so that they know that trust needs to be very carefully used as relates to this?
So what we're doing at Florida A&M is we're doing phishing campaigns led by our IT department and jointly with our audit department. And we're coming up with emails to target certain groups. So things that, let's say, a payroll person would typically see in a regular day, but turn it into what a phishing, so that they get used to seeing what a phishing campaign would look like, what a phishing email looks like, and what to look for in those types of things, whether it's misspellings or looking at the headers in the emails. So we're educating them by running phishing campaigns and then teaching them what they did when they maybe click on it. And we're looking at it in two ways. It's not just, did you click on the email, but did you click on the email and add your credentials into the fake website? And we're doing all of these and educating them. And then we're also making it competitive. So in our educational institutions, we're making it competitive to see whether the faculty or the staff or the students and who could do better. So they're talking about this as a topic consistently because they're all competitive in nature.
Okay. Great. I like what you describe as the way to go about it, because it's not just a matter of doing it once and done, but rather it needs to be a continuous exercise and trying to help the organization realize that you have to be attentive every day and not just skipping a day or so. All day, every day. So from that perspective, I think that is fantastic. As we're thinking in terms of different techniques, so I think we, to some extent, identified education or training as very important. And I'm curious about other techniques that you may be using. So Deidre, what other things come to mind in terms of that? So we started with education and training. What other things are you using as a mechanism to help prevent fraud?
So what we are doing is making sure that, one, we updated our fraud policy and actually rolled out a brand new fraud policy. And we are educating them on that. We're doing mandatory fraud trainings, and we're sending out different info on what to look like. What does fraud look like? Understanding what it looks like when they come across it. And then there are obligations for reporting and the different mechanisms they can do when they see something and report it. If you don't feel comfortable assigning your name, we're making sure that they have those avenues to report anonymously. But making them aware is the first thing. Making sure that we have our management, our president, our board, everyone speaking about this topic and pushing down the importance. So it really has to start at the top.
Great. And identifying that potential weakness in terms of senior level individuals who can also fall prey to this. So I think that those are great suggestions. So thank you very much, Deidre. As we're talking about prevention, because sometimes we think about and we invest heavily in investigation and detection, which I would like to come back later, but let's stick with this idea of prevention and even deterrence. So Jennica, in terms of how we can go about strengthening that front-end dynamic so that we don't have to play catch-up later, but rather deter and prevent fraud. What are some of the things that come to mind as great techniques that you would like to share with our audience today?
That's a great question. So no one thinks it's going to happen to them until it does. And so the best way to prevent fraud is to have an ethical tone at the top. So it really starts with your top managers. Are they performing overrides of the controls, or are they following the policies exactly as they are laid out? Do they set the tone for the organization? So it says the first part is, do you have an ethical tone? Do you have policies? Some people don't even have policies and procedures. I think it was mentioned the fraud policy. I see a lot of times people don't even have a fraud policy. So making sure that you have a lot of policies and procedures, top managers are following them. Also, an ethics hotline is probably one of the best ways to deter fraud, because if they know that someone's watching them, they might be less likely. That's also a good detection piece of it. Of course, segregating duties. A lot of times that's not possible, especially in government organizations when you just have one employee. You can't separate the accounting functions, but you could outsource some of the accounting functions. So there are a lot of prevention methods that are very affordable. Like the ethics hotline is very affordable. It's only a couple of dollars per year per employee. And then separating the duties. If you have multiple people working in the accounting department, if not, outsourcing some different tasks. Again, ethics training, having a consultant come in, that just tells your employees, we care about ethics and we want to set an ethical tone. And the more you talk about it, the less likely it is to happen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. These are great suggestions in terms of what we can do. And some of these techniques have been around for a while, yet it's interesting and to some extent surprising too when we hear of organizations who have not yet benefited from some of these dynamics. You mentioned the whistleblower hotline, and the price has come down tremendously after it was enacted by Sarbanes-Oxley many years ago, 2002. It's required by Sarbanes-Oxley. Many organizations don't have to comply with it, but perhaps it should be viewed as a best practice. And because so many organizations are implementing this tool, the price has come down. So something to look into. There's probably a carrier, a provider that can help you out at a reasonable price. Lorraine, how about your insight as relates to this? We're talking about deterrence and prevention. What thoughts do you have in terms of what kind of mechanism we can put in place that can help us in that regard?
Well, I'd like to add that in my practice, I really do look at what their ethics and code of conduct policies are within the organization and those relationships that they have outside of the business. So making sure that everyone knows what their responsibilities are, whether you're an employee, a vendor, someone that supplies materials. So that is really important. Also, employees and vendors need to know where they can go to report when something goes wrong, or wrongdoings, I should say. And I think that's really important, that people know how to report that and that it's actually going to be looked at. I mean, look at the issues with Wells Fargo. For years, people have been calling that hotline and nothing happened until social media got to it. So again, unless you instill and inspire trust within your organizations with the policies and then the follow through, it really isn't going to mean anything.
Great point there. Definitely important to raise awareness around the whole organization, and also to make people recognize the fact that it's not just the auditor or the compliance professional or department that is really looking after fraud. It is everybody's job. So from the perspective of everyone paying attention and looking out for the well-being of the entire organization, if they start to recognize the fact that anyone could be, as they are alert to the potential breakdowns there, they may become the one that shares the information for maybe the auditor to eventually investigate. But everybody's job and everybody's paying attention to it. So I think that's a very good deterrent and preventive practice. Now let's turn our attention to detection. So we share some ideas on how we can go about deterring and preventing fraud. Let's talk about detection. So let's start with you, Deidre. So what are some of the thoughts that you have in terms of what works well in terms of detection? What should we be doing and pushing within our organizations?
Well, there's a couple of things that I think is major for detecting fraud. One is the hotline, right? Most of the time, I think it's about 75% of detection comes from other people reporting. So it is extremely important that you have the hotline in place for people to be able to report. Two, with the rollout of data analytics in organizations, it's much easier now to set up continuous monitoring of certain fraud risk indicators. And I really encourage auditors as well as compliance professionals and those throughout the organization to determine what those fraud risk indicators look like for them and set up the different data analytics to continuously run, monitor, and alert them to those different types of things that may happen. And going back to the same and regular things of reconciliations, and especially in the financials that allow you to identify anomalies.
Okay, great ideas and great suggestions. Thank you very much, Deidre. So as we're thinking about detection, what are the things are we doing? What do you think, Lillian? What are some of the things that our auditors and compliance professionals should be on the lookout for? What can help them out?
Yeah, with the implementation of data analytics, it gives us an opportunity to look at whole sets of data as opposed to taking samples. And so if you have that opportunity to be able to examine or analyze, maybe a whole year worth of credit card transactions, that is very valuable when it comes to detection. You can use the analytics to identify patterns, anomalies, and so you can provide that to the business units so they can look further into it. So I think the use of data analytics, and most importantly, really understand your business so you can identify and understand those red flags, applicable to your business environment.
Great suggestions. I like those. I like those very much. Data analytics has been talked about for a long time, yet it is surprising that we still encounter gaps in its usage and we're not fully leveraging its power. Are you as surprised as I am, Lorraine?
Well, no, I guess I look at data analytics as an added tool. You still should have a third-party risk management program and a contract compliance program. Auditors need to get out of the office and go out into the field. If you are a construction company, go out and see how something is constructed. If you are manufacturing, see how something is manufactured. If you're looking at inventory, I want you to go out to that yard and look at the inventory and make sure that it's being counted, and just that whole process. Just look back and observe. I think analytics are great, but I still think you need that expert person to oversee those things.
I have a feeling, Lorraine, that there's a story that you can share about that. So
I shared that with you last night.
Can you tell us no client names, just the story? But
no
tell
client
us,
names.
Because our viewers will definitely love to hear about that, because we hear a lot about data analytics and how powerful it is, and definitely we cannot overestimate, or we don't want to minimize it. I mean, it is powerful. Yet there's value in going out there and seeing for yourself and interacting with people. So tell us a little bit more about what your experience has been there, right, and how our viewers can benefit from your knowledge.
So I like to take my team out. And so we were looking at inventory, and I brought everyone out to the yard and just to observe. And I noticed that we had material coming in, and it was A grade, which was brand new, B grade that was used out in the field but can be reused, and C was scrap. So we went through the whole tour of the business, which I always recommend, and I noticed that the A product, which was brand new, was being processed through the C, which was scrap. And so I wanted to know where that was going. And so we literally observed, and we staked it out, and we found out that there was collusion with employees to sell that material outside of the business. So there was the corruption right there, and it was just a simple observation. And so you should really understand your business and observe all of the processes within that business.
Great. Well, terrible situation, unfortunately,
Right.
but we can all learn from it, and I appreciate you sharing that story with us. So, as we're thinking in terms of the role that we play, and we never like to think of auditors as ruining anything, right? We're always going to help make things better. However, there are times when we may ruin an investigation because of the things we do or fail to do. So how about we pick up on that and talk a bit about how an auditor may unwittingly ruin the potential for an investigation that could be carried out so that we can protect the organization, recover assets, and the other actions that we would like to carry through. So, Jennica, can you tell us a little bit about how that could happen? How could an auditor, despite his or her best intentions, ruin the potential to properly investigate and potentially prosecute if necessary?
Well, I think that auditors, they discover the fraud and then they need to hand it over into the fraud experts. So they kind of need to get out of the way if they do discover it. And a lot of times they do discover it in the audit. An audit is not designed to look for fraud, but it does come up. There are a chain of commands that have to be put in place, chains of custody for documents and procedures that need to be followed. And if things get too many hands on them, even though the auditor is trying to help, the best thing for them to do is just to turn it over to the fraud experts, have them come in, and then kind of stay out of their way.
Mm-hmm. Great advice. Absolutely. Thank you very much. In terms of this dynamic around handing over that piece of information once we identify that as a potential fraudulent situation, what is your experience with that dynamic, Lillian? What do you think about that, and how can auditors do that well? How can they avoid ruining the potential for a successful prosecution?
I think internal auditors, number one, we need to understand our authority when it comes to investigations and evidence and collecting evidence. So I think that's important, is the education piece again on what our authority is. But then really learning about fraud investigation. And many times we try to focus on internal audit and performance and operational audit, but if our responsibility is fraud investigation as well, I think it's important for us to know what the standards for evidence collection and where does our work stop and where do we need to, turn it over. But I think protecting the evidence and protecting the assets involved in a fraud is very important when investigating fraud and making sure that we can prosecute.
Mm-hmm. This is very helpful. And we were talking earlier about the importance of policies and the procedures as well. And we need those within the organization. We need them within internal audit as well. So what you're highlighting seems to point in that direction. Deidre, is that also something that you have seen necessary in many cases where the internal audit department perhaps needs to tighten up their policies as relates to that, how they're training their auditors to identify what looks fraudulent and know when to hand it over? Is that something you've seen?
Yes, absolutely. So auditors need to understand both how to go and gather evidence and understand what their role is in it. But also, it's not just the evidence gathering, it's also part of the interview process and understanding how the questions that you're asking during an audit, especially if you've already considered and thinking that it may be fraudulent, the questions that you continue to ask during the process is also very critical, because depending on the state and the government rules and the laws you're in, there's certain things and rules you have to follow. And so you need to understand all of that when you're asking and you're identifying this fraud. So education of the actual audit staff on fraud, they should be trained, whether or not they are actually conducting that fraud investigation, they should receive that training so that they can appreciate what they are doing. So when they uncover something, then they're more cognizant of when to turn it over. But also understanding the different fraud schemes and the different things of that nature. When they're going through an audit, you should always be cognizant of what those fraud risk indicators are for every audit or engagement that you're doing.
So, Deidre, on that note, as we're thinking in terms of interviews, the traditional sense, and interviews in a fraud context, what are some of the differences between the two? Because I would imagine that some auditors may not be fully clear on what's the difference between a traditional interview and a fraud-based interview. Can you help us with that?
So when you're doing a traditional interview, you're asking just to gather information, maybe try to understand a process, things of that nature. But in a fraud interview, you are always cognizant this information can be used in a court of law. So you don't want to lead them anywhere. You want them to be open. You want to give some background. You really want to be cognizant of the body language that they're portraying in a fraud interview, because all of this kinds of rolls into what they're doing. But also you're looking and you're asking those questions to determine whether something is happening, determine the truthfulness of their actions and what they're saying. And so you're leading them down a different path than a traditional interview. And you really are trying to, in that fraud interview, to figure out whether something happened, whether there's evidence, and whether or not you know what the next steps are to do. So you're really pulling it all together versus a traditional interview. You're just asking those questions to really try to get to the end of some process or thing that you're looking at. But the fraud is completely different. There's things that you have to ask. You may have to make them aware of that, hey, you have the right to not self-incriminate, right? For us, where we're at, a lot of our interviews are recorded. So you have to be cognizant of when you can record their rights around that. And so it's very different. It's a different atmosphere and is way more formal most of the time when you're doing a fraud interview versus a regular traditional interview.
Jennica, on that note, can you help us with this? I'm very curious about the differences between a traditional interview and a fraud-based interview. So can you help us understand a little bit more? So as we are just learning a bit from Deidre, what other thoughts come to mind about the differences between the two and what we can do to make sure that we know our place and that we handle it appropriately?
I guess the biggest thing would be, could this end up in court? And you have to conduct the interview as though it would go in front of a judge. And you have to follow laws and rules, and each state is different. There are procedures that you have to follow and a step-by-step plan of action. So you can't just, I think I'm going to ask them about this. You have to thoughtfully and carefully plan out the interview to make sure, like Deidre said, that you're not leading the witness and asking incriminating questions, and you're just trying to find the truth. And with a traditional interview, it's more about, well, how does this policy happen? Show me what you're doing in this situation. And then in a fraud interview, it gets more specific to that particular incident. You're not going to ask general questions. It's more specific about the fraud. And again, making sure that you're following all the laws. And that's why it's so important to have a fraud expert come in and not try to do it yourself, because you could get in trouble.
Those are very important things to keep in mind. Thank you very much. As we're thinking about this and how it applies in the private sector versus government and nonprofits, Lillian, what are your thoughts about this question around knowing the differences between the two and what our audience needs to be mindful of? So how can they, if they're in the private sector, but you have so much experience in the government sector, what are some thoughts as relates to that?
I think it's important to remember, like in internal audit, we have these meetings to build rapport with the business unit. We usually meet with the business unit first, as opposed to a fraud investigation. We try to gather the evidence first and then meet with the subject. And I think that's important. That's something to be mindful of when you are conducting a fraud investigation. And understanding the law, whether when you're recording an interview, is it a two-party state or is it a one-party state? So it's so important to understand those statutory limitations that relate to fraud, but definitely the type of interview questions that you ask, in In internal audit, we ask a lot of open-ended questions because we want to know, we want to learn about the process. But in fraud investigations, we've gathered enough evidence and information to kind of know what's going on. We just need to corroborate and really validate the information we already have.
Very, very important indeed. So as we're thinking in terms of the differences, and we were talking earlier in terms of the policies and the procedures and how important it is to be clear about that, making sure we know when to hand it over to an expert as well. So training becomes very important in this conversation as well, because we need to make sure that our auditors are aware of these things so they know in different jurisdictions and where the lines are drawn. As we're thinking about these dynamics and examples of frauds that have occurred, I've seen over the years that I've practiced a lot of different dynamics that turn out to be fraudulent. One of those had to do with something that was mentioned earlier in the panel conversation around segregation of duties, where a secretary was using the P card and purchasing personal items and charging it back to the organization, and that was discovered through just number, footing, cross-footing numbers and looking at transactions, and then that led into a full inquiry as to what was bought, where these things were delivered, and then it was uncovered, and that was handled appropriately. But in terms of examples or stories, right, we asked Lorraine earlier, I am wondering if I could go around a little bit and ask each one of you about a particular story that you've had where it turned out to be fraud, and how you discovered it, or maybe one of your department colleagues identified it. So, Deidre, can you think of a situation, a case where you or one of your colleagues identified fraud? How was it detected? What happened around it?
So, as I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of grants. And at those grants, some of them go with our agricultural forms and stuff that our university has. And so what we've been discovering some is that, hey, there's animals going missing because they're selling them and pocketing the money. There's tractor and farm equipment going missing, and it's not showing up because you're still charging the grants. And so till you do that grant review is when you reveal that, hey, these animals are no longer on the farm. This equipment is no longer on the farm. And so it's important and that's how it's being discovered when you're doing these grant interviews and you're looking and doing different internal control reviews of the different areas that they're having those controls in place. And when they don't have control, you're going out, as Lorraine said earlier, and laying eyes on the things that are supposed to be there. Mm-hmm. So in this instance, we had discovered a researcher reported that they had that, hey, my bull I need for my grant is gone. So we had to go out and we looked into it to figure out really what was going on, and had to discover, well, who authorized that sale. And those are the kind of things that we see. And then and we mentioned earlier, another one that's come up recently was the double pay, where people are going out working 2 separate jobs. And a lot of that is you start to get those by the reports that other employees are putting in. So then you have to put on your detective cap and go out and figure out what's going on. It's a lot of granular work, looking through payroll and seeing when they were on campus, when they're off campus, what they're doing, if they were working remotely, seeing if you have the ability to work with the other companies that they're supposedly working with, and will they turn over information.
Brings us back to some of these traditional things, observation and reconciliations and inventory control and so on. So as we're thinking about different dynamics like these and how we can better illustrate the concepts and experiences we've had, Lorraine, have you been exposed to other dynamics that eventually turn into fraudulent actions? And can you share this with our audience today?
Well, one thing I like to do is advise companies at the onset of a red flag is to bring in everyone involved in terms of legal, corporate security, and the internal audit, and also HR, any of those stakeholders that need to be involved. And then I advise them on the actual investigation plan. And so I think it's really important to have that plan there. So I had a call from a company that there was a red flag of 2 employees, 2 trusted employees. And they both colluded with each other to create a business. And what they did was it was an accounting manager and a VP of the company. The accounting manager went into the system and changed the vendor number information of an old vendor that they haven't used in a while and exchanged it for their new company. And the VP would request work to be done from this company, and he was also the approver. So at first, the invoices came in, it was like $10,000, and it was signed off by the VP. The accounting manager just pushed it through, and no one was the wiser because it was kind of small amounts. But then over time, it became $500,000 a year for 10 years. So what would you do in this instance? You look at the company itself. It really was a shell of a company. There was no real footprint. And you realize that the services weren't even done. It was for marketing. And the invoice had no detail to it. So the only reason why this was even picked up was because there was a layoff and a reorganization, and both those people did not work in that company. So again, you're looking at the investigation, you're looking at how to plan for that investigation, and how to advise legal and corporate security on how to handle that.
So I would like to introduce a question that was raised by one of our viewers. So in terms of vendor fraud, we spoke about vendor fraud a little bit, but we have a very specific question here. With regards to vendor fraud, is the fraud more likely to be committed by the suppliers, that means the organization, or the employee of the firm being supplied to? So if you think about that question, what would you say is the answer to that? With regards to vendor fraud, is the fraud more likely to be committed by the supplier or by the employee? What do you think, Lillian?
I think it can be both. In regards to the type of fraud, I would say, you talk about bid rigging and things of that nature, then it could be it could be a collusion of the vendor and the employee, for that matter. I think when it comes to fake companies and shell companies, that's employee related. And it could be, again, collusion as well. So I think in government, it's a combination of both, really.
So thank you very much to everyone for your insights. This has been very, very helpful to better understand the dynamics around it and how fraud can occur. And once again, we go back to some of the traditional things we've learned, and we need to always remember that as we also look forward at how the fraudulent actions are changing, how the demographics are changing, how the tools are changing, a lot of the fundamentals are still the same. So we want to hold on to those. So thank you very much to our panel. And I appreciate your insights and your stories. Definitely help us better understand this challenging topic. So thank you very much.
If you like this series, subscribe to the ACI Learning YouTube channel to enjoy more audit-related content.